Chapter 1: The Shift You Feel, Not See. Larry Connor had always been what most people would describe as an easy man to please, which, in his experience, was both a compliment and a misunderstanding. He didn't think of himself as simple. He thought of himself as precise. There were only two things he genuinely required from the people in his life: honesty and respect. Everything else, in Larry's mind, fell cleanly into the category of negotiable variables. Preferences, habits, opinions, all adjustable so long as the foundation remained intact. It made life quieter that way, cleaner, less crowded with unnecessary conflict. Felicia used to tease him about it when they first started dating. "You're like a contract," she'd said once, curled into his side during a late-night movie marathon. "Clear terms, minimal clauses. I always know what I'm getting." Larry had smiled at that, not entirely disagreeing. "I'd argue I'm user-friendly," he replied. She laughed, pressing her forehead against his shoulder. "You're something." That had been 5 years ago. 3 years into marriage now, Larry still believed in those two core requirements. Still believed in clarity. Still believed that understanding mattered more than agreement. But belief, he'd learned early in life, had very little to do with reality changing itself to accommodate it. His father used to say something similar in a less gentle tone. "Truth doesn't care how you feel about it, Larry. Once you know it, your opinion becomes decoration." At the time, Larry had been 9 and deeply offended by the idea that his opinions could be categorized as decorative. Now, at 31, he understood exactly what his father meant, which was why, over the last year, Larry had paid very close attention. Not suspicious attention, not paranoid attention, just noticing. It had started with Felicia's promotion. Team lead, more responsibility, longer hours, more pressure from people above and below her. At first, Larry had responded exactly the way he believed a supportive husband should. He adapted. More dinners cooked, more chores absorbed into his routine, less expectation of shared downtime. When she came home and dropped onto the couch with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a small office, he didn't crowd her with questions. He made tea instead. "Rough day?" he'd ask, and she'd nod, leaning into his shoulder, her presence soft and familiar. "Just people," she'd murmur. Larry understood that. People were complicated. Work made them more so. For a while, the system worked. Then it didn't. The first shift wasn't obvious. It never is. If someone had asked Larry to pinpoint the exact moment something changed, he wouldn't have been able to. Not because it wasn't there, but because it didn't announce itself. It diluted, less reaching for his hand when they crossed the street. Quicker goodnight kisses that felt scheduled. Conversations that skimmed the surface instead of settling into depth. On paper, nothing had disappeared entirely. In reality, something essential had. Larry noticed it the way he noticed all things, by contrast, by deviation from established patterns. He'd first heard the idea when he was 7 years old, sitting quietly at his grandparents' house while his grandfather and uncle argued in the kitchen. Larry couldn't remember what they were arguing about, only the tone, sharp, stubborn, circling the same point. And then his grandfather had said, calm but firm, "People only change their behaviors when something has changed in their life." Larry had carried that sentence with him ever since, tested it, observed it, confirmed it. Habits didn't break themselves. Patterns didn't dissolve without reason. So when Felicia's habits shifted, Larry didn't react immediately. He observed. The texting started to increase. First, it made sense. Work, new responsibilities, constant communication. But then there were smaller details. She checked her phone without notifications, glanced at the screen, then quickly away, smiled. Not the polite, tired curve of her lips he'd seen after long days. A real smile, the kind that reached her eyes, the kind he remembered being the cause of once. Larry hadn't asked who she was texting. He didn't need to. The information wasn't in the identity. It was in the behavior. Then came the final adjustment, the one that completed the pattern. She turned off notifications for someone. Larry noticed it not because of sound, but because of absence. Because she began checking her phone at intervals that didn't correspond to alerts. He recognized the change immediately, not wanting him to know when a message arrived. It was such a small action, almost nothing taken alone. But Larry didn't take things alone. He took them in sequence, and the sequence formed a conclusion. Maybe not absolute truth, but enough truth. He didn't confront her. That surprised him a little. You'd think, for someone who valued honesty so highly, confrontation would come naturally. It didn't, because Larry understood something else, too. Information obtained too early often became contaminated by performance. If he asked, she might answer. But the answer would no longer exist in a natural state. He wanted to understand the reality he was already living in, not a modified version of it. So instead, Larry adjusted again. Quietly, he stopped expecting. Not in a bitter way, in a practical one. If she was tired, he didn't suggest spending time together. If she didn't reach for his hand, he didn't reach first. If she smiled at her phone, he looked away. He maintained the structure of their life. Bills paid. House maintained. Conversations functional. He was still a good husband. Just no longer an available one in the same way. And underneath it all, he started thinking. About his life. About his future. About his house. That part, oddly enough, was the most concrete concern. It wasn't just a house. It was something his grandfather had helped make possible. An inheritance. A beginning. Larry wasn't willing to lose it. Not to circumstance. Not to someone else's decisions. So he did what he always did when faced with uncertainty. He gathered data. He reviewed finances. He considered scenarios. He mapped outcomes in his mind like branching paths, all while making breakfast the next morning like nothing had changed. Felicia walked into the kitchen, still half absorbed in her phone. "Morning," she said absently. "Morning," Larry replied, sliding a plate toward her. She sat down, glanced at it, then at him. "You didn't have to cook." "I know," he said simply. She nodded faintly, already looking back at her screen. And then it happened again. That smile. Quick, bright, uninhibited. Larry took a sip of his coffee. Observed. Confirmed. Something had changed. He didn't know exactly what yet. But he knew this much with absolute clarity. Whatever it wasn't small. And whatever came next, he would meet it the same way he met everything else. With calm. With logic. And without illusion. Chapter 2, Patterns Don't Lie. Larry Connor did not spiral. That was the first thing worth clarifying, at least in his own mind. If anyone had observed him objectively over the next 2 weeks, they would have found nothing dramatic to report. He woke up at the same time. He went to work. He returned home. He cooked dinner with the same quiet efficiency. He asked Felicia how her day was, and when she said, "Busy," he nodded as if that single word removed the need for further inquiry. From the outside, it looked like stability. Internally, Larry had simply changed his method. Where most people might have leaned into emotion, suspicion, anxiety, anger, Larry leaned into structure. He began categorizing. Not consciously at first. It just happened. He had always processed the world through patterns. It was how he understood people, situations, and even himself. Now he was applying that same framework to his marriage, not as a husband trying to fix something, but as an observer trying to understand it before deciding whether it was fixable at all. There were 4 categories that mattered: behavior, frequency, context, deviation. It sounded clinical when laid out like that, but for Larry it felt grounding. The first category, behavior, was simple enough. Felicia texted often. She smiled at her phone. She repositioned the screen slightly away from him without making it obvious she was doing so. She checked for messages even when none arrived. None of these were individually alarming. All of them together formed something more interesting. The second category, frequency, was where things became clearer. It wasn't just that she texted a lot. It was when. Morning before work. Midday during lunch. Evening, especially in the quiet in-between moments when most couples naturally drifted toward each other without thinking about it. The pattern was consistent enough to stand on its own. The third category, context, added another layer. Felicia didn't talk about these conversations. Not once had she said, "Oh, I was talking to," or "You'll like this." Listen to what? Nothing. Silence in the places where sharing used to exist. That wasn't just unusual. It was new. And the fourth category, deviation, was the most important one. Because deviation wasn't about what was happening. It was about what had stopped happening. Felicia no longer leaned into him on the couch. She no longer reached for his hand when they passed each other in the kitchen. Those small, almost unconscious touches that used to punctuate their space. She hadn't initiated intimacy in months. And when Larry had, earlier in the year, she had smiled apologetically and said, "I'm just really tired tonight. Okay?" At the time, he had accepted that. Now, in retrospect, the phrase had changed form. He didn't hear exhaustion anymore. He heard disinterest. To Larry, patterns weren't just information. They were evidence. And evidence, when sufficient, didn't require confirmation to be understood. Still, he checked himself. Every good conclusion, his father had once told him, deserved at least one attempt at being disproven. So Larry didn't act immediately. Instead, he tested. Not in a confrontational way. Not through traps or manipulations. He adjusted variables. One evening, he came home earlier than usual. Not announced. Not hidden. Just different. Felicia was on the couch, phone in hand, smiling softly at something on the screen. Larry paused in the doorway long enough to register the moment before stepping in. "Hey," he said. She startled slightly, not dramatically, but enough. "Hey," she replied, quickly lowering the phone into her lap. "Didn't expect you this early." "I wrapped up everything ahead of schedule," Larry said, setting his bag down. "Thought I'd take advantage of it." She nodded, but her attention had already returned to the device, fingers resuming their quiet rhythm. Larry watched the transition without comment. Test 1. Behavior unchanged by his presence. He moved into the kitchen, started preparing dinner. A few minutes later, he tried something else. "Hey, do you want to hear something weird?" he called out casually. Felicia glanced up. "What?" "I got an email from a company I've never heard of offering me a job I'm not qualified for. Apparently, they value confidence over experience." A small smile appeared on her face. "That sounds fake." Probably, Larry agreed. Still considering it. Could be my big break. She laughed softly, but it was brief. Yeah, let me know how that goes. And then she was back to her phone. Test 2. Engagement minimal, short-lived. Larry nodded to himself, stirring a pan with absent precision. The tests weren't about proving she was doing something wrong. They were about confirming what had already changed. Another evening, he tried sitting closer to her on the couch. Not touching, just proximity. She didn't move away, but she didn't close the distance either. It remained exactly as he said it. Neutral, controlled, unchanged. Test 3. No passive reconnection. Larry leaned back, watching the television without really seeing it. In the quiet spaces between dialogue on the screen, he could hear the faint, steady taps of her thumbs against glass. It was almost rhythmic, predictable, comforting in a way he didn't expect, because predictability removed uncertainty. And uncertainty was the only thing that complicated decisions. By the end of the second week, Larry had enough. Not absolute truth, but sufficient clarity. He didn't know who she was texting. He didn't know the exact nature of the relationship. He didn't know whether it had crossed from emotional to physical. But he knew something had replaced him in her attention hierarchy. And more importantly, he knew he was no longer competing for space. That part, more than anything, settled something inside him. Because Larry had never believed in competing for affection. Not in friendships, not in family, and not in marriage. If someone required convincing to value your presence, the value wasn't real in the first place. So he made a decision. Not out loud, not dramatically, just internally. He stopped offering. Not affection entirely, not kindness, just intention. He no longer initiated touch. No longer suggested activities together. No longer filled silence with conversation. He let the space exist as it was. And in doing so, something unexpected happened. He had time. Felt strange at first. Like discovering an empty room in a house he'd lived in for years. Evenings stretched differently now. After dinner, instead of sitting beside Felicia waiting for something that didn't come, Larry began doing other things. Small things. He reorganized the garage, sorted through old documents, took longer walks after work. One night, he stood in the doorway of the spare room and realized it had slowly turned into a storage space rather than a usable one. That bothered him more than it should have. So he fixed it. He cleared it out piece by piece, rearranging boxes, throwing away things that no longer served a purpose. At one point, Felicia passed by, glancing into the room. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making space," Larry replied. She looked around, brows pulling together slightly. For what? Larry considered the question. Felt bigger than the room itself. "Not sure yet," he said honestly. She didn't respond right away, just nodded faintly and continued down the hallway. Later that night, Larry stood in the middle of the newly cleared room, hands on his hips, surveying the open space. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't finished. But it was intentional. He liked that. Behind him, faint through the wall, he could hear Felicia's soft laughter. Not directed at him. At someone on the other side of a screen. Larry didn't turn toward the sound. He didn't need to. He already understood it. And understanding, as always, made the next step easier. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect, not emotionally but analytically. His grandfather's voice surfaced again, steady and certain. People only change their behaviors when something has changed in their life. Larry looked down at the water in his glass, the surface still and undisturbed. "Okay," he murmured softly, more to the idea than to himself. Something changed. He took a sip, then straightened. The natural next question followed without hesitation. "What does that mean for me?" And for the first time since he'd noticed the shift, Larry realized something important. He wasn't trying to fix this. He was preparing to live without it. Not recklessly, not prematurely, just accurately. Because if the truth didn't care how he felt about it, then neither could he. And somewhere in the quiet clarity of that realization, Larry Connor felt something unexpected settle into place. Not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty. And for him, that was always enough. Chapter 3, The Saturday Night Question. Saturday nights had once carried a gentle predictability in Larry and Felicia's house. Not routine in the rigid sense. Larry wasn't particularly fond of rigid anything. But there had been a rhythm. Dinner a little later than usual. Something half-watched on television. Conversation that wandered, unhurried, into places that had nothing to do with bills or deadlines. A shared exhale at the end of the week. That version of Saturday had receded over time without either of them marking the moment it disappeared. This Saturday, like the others recently, was quieter. Felicia had spent most of the evening on the couch, angled slightly away, her phone held just out of Larry's line of sight without appearing deliberately so. The light from the screen occasionally caught her expression, softening it, lifting it. Larry noticed. He always noticed. But where he might once have tried to engage, to draw her into conversation or suggest doing something together, he didn't tonight. He finished loading the dishwasher, dried his hands, and paused briefly in the doorway to the living room. Felicia let out a small laugh, the kind that escaped before it could be moderated. Bright, reflexive. Larry leaned his shoulder against the frame for a moment, observing the sound rather than the cause. Then he turned and headed down the hall. Going to bed? She called after him. Yeah, he replied without hesitation. I'm tired. It wasn't untrue. Not physically, but in a way that felt more structural. Okay, she said. No follow-up. No, I'll come in a bit. Just the quiet continuity of whatever existed on the other side of her screen. Larry nodded once to himself and continued into the bedroom. The room was dim except for the bedside lamp, which he left on out of habit. He changed, brushed his teeth, and settled into bed with the same measured calm that had defined his movements for weeks now. He didn't check his phone. He had nothing he was waiting for. That realization still felt new enough to notice. Time passed, how much he wasn't entirely sure. The soft sounds of the house carried through the walls. A faucet running briefly. The faint creak of floorboards. Then the bedroom door opened. Felicia stepped in, moving quietly, as though trying not to disturb him even though the light was still on and his eyes were open. You're still up, she said, her voice softer now. Yeah. She closed the door behind her and crossed the room, placing her phone on the nightstand on her side. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at him. It wasn't a long moment, but it was unusual. Larry registered that too. You okay? She asked. I'm fine. She nodded slowly, then reached up and turned off the lamp. Darkness settled over the room, broken only by the faint glow from outside filtering through the curtains. In the quiet, Larry shifted slightly under the covers, preparing to settle into sleep. He heard the subtle rustle as Felicia got into bed beside him. For a second, everything felt still, and then a gentle touch. Her fingers brushed his shoulder, light but intentional. Larry flinched, not dramatically, but enough that the movement broke the quiet more sharply than the touch itself. Felicia pulled her hand back immediately. Hey, what was that? She asked, a hint of surprise slipping into her voice. You okay? Yeah, Larry said after a brief pause. Just startled. Startled? She repeated, baffled. It's me. I know. There was a small pause. Then the mattress shifted as she moved closer, her hand returning, more cautious this time. Larry's body reacted before he had time to analyze it. He rolled slightly away, creating space between them. Her hand stopped mid-motion. What are you doing? He asked. The question landed with more weight than volume. Felicia froze. What do you mean? She replied slowly. You're trying to... Larry gestured vaguely in the dark, then let his hand fall back to the mattress. What are you doing? Another pause, longer this time. I'm just... She exhaled, confusion edging into her tone. I wanted to be close to my husband. Larry turned his head slightly on the pillow, his gaze settling in her direction even though he couldn't see her clearly. Why? The word came out calm, unembellished. Felicia sat up. The mattress dipped slightly as her weight shifted away from him. What do you mean why? She asked, her voice tightening just enough to register. Larry didn't sit up. He remained where he was, one arm resting across his chest, eyes open. It's a question, he said. Why do you want to be close to your husband? He paused, then added, just as evenly, more precisely, why do you want to be close to your husband now? Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind filled with shared understanding. The silence had edges. Felicia didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice had dropped, quieter, uncertain. What's going on, Larry? Larry let out a slow breath. There it was. The moment. Not explosive. Not loud. Just inevitable. You haven't touched me in over 6 months, he said. The words measured, factual. You spend most of your free time talking to someone you've never mentioned. You're happy. He turned his head slightly more toward her. Not with me. That lingered for a second before he continued. With whatever that is. Felicia inhaled sharply. What are you talking about? She said, her voice climbing defensively. Who am I talking to? Larry didn't answer that. He shook his head slightly, even though she couldn't see it clearly. That's not the part I'm trying to understand, he said. I'm trying to understand why now. Why now? She repeated. Yes. He shifted, finally pushing himself up to sit, resting his back against the headboard. The faint outside light caught part of his expression. Calm, but intent. You've had time, he continued. A lot of it. So either something changed, or this is... He gestured again, searching briefly for the right word. Convenient. Felicia's shoulders tensed. That's not fair, she said quickly. I've been stressed, Larry. You know that. Work has been... I do know that, he interrupted gently. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dismiss her. He just placed her statement aside. And I adjusted, he continued. I gave you space. I picked up more around the house. I didn't push when you said you were tired. His tone didn't shift. If anything, it became even more level. But being tired for 6 months isn't a state. It's a pattern. Felicia stared at him. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and something less defined. I haven't cheated on you, she said abruptly. The words came out fast, too fast to feel considered. Larry watched her for a moment. I didn't say you had. You implied it, she shot back. He tilted his head slightly. Did I? Yes, she insisted. Right now you're acting like, are you pregnant? The question cut cleanly through the space between them. Felicia went still, completely still. The reaction wasn't loud. It was immediate. Her face drained of color in the dim light, her mouth parting slightly as the words landed. What? She whispered. I'm asking, Larry said, still calm. Because if you are, then timing would explain. I'm not pregnant, she said quickly, the words sharper now. Of course I'm not. And I haven't cheated on you. Larry held her gaze for a moment longer before nodding once. Okay. The simplicity of his response seemed to unsettle her more than anything else he'd said. Okay? She repeated. Yes. That's it? She asked, incredulous. You just, okay? Larry leaned his head back against the headboard, eyes drifting briefly toward the ceiling. What else would you like me to say? He asked. I don't know, something? She said, frustration creeping in. You're accusing me of something and then just dropping it? I'm not accusing you, he said. I'm telling you what I think. And what is that? She demanded. Larry looked back at her. That maybe you're cheating on me, he said plainly. Maybe you're not. But the relevant part isn't what is. It's what I believe. Felicia stared at him, shock deepening into something closer to panic. Larry, I'm not putting my health at risk on trust one don't have, he finished. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. Felicia's expression crumpled slightly at the edges. Not dramatic, not tearful, just shaken. Where is this coming from? She asked, almost pleading now. Why would you think that? Larry studied her for a long second. Then he exhaled, slow and steady. I already told you, he said. His voice softened, not with warmth, but with certainty. People don't change their behaviors for no reason. Neither of them spoke after that. The space between them, once invisible, now felt clearly defined. Not as a gap, but as something measurable. And for the first time since the shift had begun, Felicia Connor saw it too. Chapter 4, The Audit of a Marriage. The house did not change overnight. That was the first thing Felicia noticed. She woke up the next morning in the same bed, under the same light filtering faintly through the curtains, with the same distant hum of early traffic threading through the quiet. Nothing had been rearranged. Nothing had been broken. And yet something fundamental was no longer where she had left it. Larry was already awake. Not unusual. But usually she would feel it. Some small presence before she fully opened her eyes. The sound of him moving around in the kitchen, or the quiet clink of a cup being set down, or the almost inaudible rhythm of him existing nearby. Today, what she felt first was absence. Not physical absence, structural absence. She sat up slowly, glancing at his side of the bed. Empty, the impression in the pillow already fading. For a moment, she replayed the conversation from the night before. The words didn't echo the way she expected them to. There wasn't anger attached to them. No raised voice. No accusations thrown in desperation. Just clarity. That unsettled her more than anything else. If Larry had been angry, she would have known what to do. Anger meant conflict, and conflict meant engagement. There were steps for that. Apologies, explanations, repair. But this felt like something had already been decided, and she hadn't been present for the decision. Felicia swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet meeting the cool floor as she stood. Larry? She called out, more out of habit than expectation. I'm in the kitchen, came his voice, even, distant. She paused, surprised. Not by where he was, by how he sounded. She stepped into the hallway and walked toward the kitchen, her mind still trying to organize itself into something coherent. Larry stood at the counter, slicing fruit with the same measured precision he applied to everything. A plate sat beside him, already partially arranged. He didn't look up when she entered. Morning, he said. Morning, she replied automatically. The exchange felt normal. And that was wrong. Felicia lingered in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. She waited for something, an acknowledgement, a continuation, something that anchored them back into familiarity. None came. Instead, Larry finished slicing the fruit, set the knife down, and moved toward the coffee maker. Felicia stepped forward. About last night, she started. I made breakfast, Larry interrupted gently, not looking at her. You should eat before you go. She stopped. The sentence wasn't defensive. It wasn't dismissive. It was adjacent, as if her attempt at conversation had been redirected without being directly addressed. I'm not really hungry, she said. That's fine, he replied. It's there if you change your mind. He poured coffee into 2 cups, then set one on the counter across from where she now stood. She watched him, studied the small things, the way he moved, the way he didn't pause, the way he didn't fill silence anymore. It felt like watching someone she knew very well, and realizing that knowing wasn't the same as understanding. Felicia pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. "We should talk about it," she said. Larry finally looked at her. Not sharply, not intensely, just directly. "I think we did," he replied. Her fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. "That wasn't a conversation," she said. "That was you asking if I was pregnant." Larry's expression didn't change. "It was a question." "Like that makes it better," she muttered. He shrugged faintly, turning his attention back to his coffee. "It makes it accurate." Felicia stared at him for a second, trying to find some opening, some way to pull him back into something that resembled the man she was used to. "You think I'm cheating on you," she said. "I think something changed," he corrected. "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Silence stretched between them again. Felicia pressed her lips together, then leaned forward slightly. "I'm not cheating on you," she said, more firmly this time. Larry nodded once. "Okay." There it was again. That word. Flat. Accepting. Unmoved. "You don't believe me," she said. He considered that. "Not enough to rely on it," he answered. The honesty of it caught her off balance. "Why?" she demanded, frustration slipping through now. "What have I actually done?" Larry rested his hands lightly on the counter. "Changed," he said simply. "That's not a crime," she shot back. "No," he said. "It's not. But it's not neutral either." Felicia let out a sharp breath, pushing back her chair slightly as she stood. "You're acting like I did something to you," she said. "Like I've been secretly, what? Building this whole other life behind your back." Larry tilted his head slightly. "I didn't say secretly," he said. Her eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Larry said calmly, "that whatever changed didn't need to be hidden to have an impact." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The argument wasn't going the way she expected, because it didn't feel like an argument. It felt like trying to push against something that wasn't pushing back. "That doesn't even make sense," she muttered. Larry didn't respond. Not immediately. Instead, he took his coffee and walked past her toward the hallway. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Spare room," he said. "I've got a few things to finish." Felicia turned, following him with her gaze as he disappeared down the hall. A minute later, she heard the faint sound of movement, boxes shifting, something being set down. That room again, making space. She stood there for another moment, the weight of the silence settling differently now. Not empty, but crowded with things she hadn't been noticing. Then, almost without thinking, she walked down the hallway and stopped in the doorway of the spare room. Larry stood near the far wall, adjusting a shelf he'd set up the day before. The room looked intentional now, clean, functional, defined. "Since when do you care about this room?" she asked. Larry didn't turn around. "It bothered me that it didn't have a purpose," he said. Felicia crossed her arms lightly. "It's a spare room. That is its purpose." "Unused isn't a purpose," he replied. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "You've been doing a lot of stuff lately," she said. "Cleaning, organizing, going out more." Larry nodded once. "I have time." The words landed harder than their tone suggested. Felicia pushed off the frame, stepping into the room. "You've always had time," she said. Larry finally turned toward her. "No," he corrected gently. "I've always made time." The distinction settled between them. Uncomfortable. Precise. Felicia forced a small laugh, though it came out thinner than she intended. "So what, now you just don't?" Larry met her eyes. "I don't insert myself where I'm not needed," he said. "I need you," she said quickly. The response came faster than she had time to think about it. Larry didn't react immediately. He studied her for a second, not skeptically, not dismissively, but carefully. "Do you?" he asked. Felicia blinked. "Of course I do." He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the statement without fully engaging with it. "Then that's something you should probably show," he said. The words weren't unkind, but they weren't comforting either. Felicia felt something tighten in her chest. Not quite panic, but close enough to make her shift her weight. "I've just been busy," she said, quieter now. "You know that." "I do," Larry said. "And this job, it's a lot. I didn't realize how much it would take." "I believe that," he interrupted. She paused. "Then why are you acting like I abandoned you or something?" Larry exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly to the now orderly shelves before returning to her. "Because functionally," he said, "that's what it looks like." The words weren't harsh, but they were exact. Felicia flinched as if they had been. "I didn't mean to," she said. "I know." He said it so easily that it almost made it worse. "Intent isn't the same as impact." Felicia fell silent. There it was again. That clarity. That absence of emotion where she expected resistance. And beneath it, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Not defensiveness. Something simpler. Recognition. She looked around the room again, the clean surfaces, the newly defined space, and then back at Larry. "You really think something changed?" she said. "I know it did," he replied. "And you're just okay with that? Larry's expression softened slightly, not emotionally, but in a way that suggested quiet acceptance. I'm adjusting to it, he said. Felicia swallowed, her throat tightening unexpectedly. Without me, she said. Larry didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice was steady. I'm still here. The pause that followed said the rest. But not the way it used to. Not automatically. Not without question. Felicia stood there, the weight of that difference settling fully for the first time. And somewhere in that quiet realization, a new understanding began to take shape, not of what Larry had done, but of what she hadn't. Chapter 5, The Promotion That Took Too Much. Felicia did not go to work on Monday with clarity. She went with noise, not external noise. The office was its usual combination of quiet tension and low conversations, but internal, layered, relentless. The kind that didn't form complete thoughts so much as overlapping ones, each trying to prove something different at the same time. Larry's voice lingered in her mind in a way that refused distortion. He hadn't raised it. He hadn't pushed. He hadn't even tried to convince her of anything. He had simply stated. That was the problem. Statements didn't leave room for easy rebuttals. They sat there, intact, waiting for you to either prove them wrong or recognize that you couldn't. Felicia dropped into her chair at her desk, exhaling as she set her bag down. Morning. The voice came from her left. She glanced up to see Dana leaning against the divider between their workstations, coffee in hand and eyebrows already slightly raised in quiet observation. Dana had that look most mornings, somewhere between curious and amused, but today it carried something sharper. Morning, Felicia replied. Dana tilted her head, studying her more directly. You look like you tried to solve a problem that didn't have an answer, she said. Felicia blinked. That's specific, huh? I've had practice, Dana replied, lifting her coffee in a small, nonchalant shrug. What's going on? Felicia hesitated, not because she didn't want to answer, but because she wasn't sure how. There was no clean entry point into what had happened. No filter version? Dana added. Felicia let out a quiet breath through her nose. My husband thinks I'm cheating on him. Dana didn't choke on her coffee, but she came close. That escalated fast, she said, lowering the cup carefully. Okay, context. Felicia leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment before speaking again. He asked me if I was pregnant, she said. Dana's eyebrows lifted higher. I'm going to need you to walk me through how we got there, she said. Felicia huffed softly, dropping her gaze back down. He says I've changed, she began. That I don't touch him anymore. I'm always on my phone, I don't spend time with him. And that I look happy, just not with him. Dana was quiet for a beat. Then she nodded once. Okay, she said slowly. Were you laughing while texting someone right before he asked if you were pregnant? Felicia frowned. That's not the point. It is a point, Dana corrected, not unkindly. If you want to understand how his brain got there. Felicia crossed her arms lightly. I'm not cheating on him, she said firmly. I didn't ask if you were, Dana replied. I asked what it looked like. The distinction landed. Felicia pressed her lips together. I've just been busy, she said after a moment. This job, it's a lot. I told you that when I got promoted. Dana nodded again. You did. And you were right. And he knows that, Felicia continued. He's been supportive. She paused, the words catching slightly. He's been doing more around the house, giving me space. And you've been taking it, Dana said. It wasn't accusatory. It was observational. Felicia shifted in her chair. Yeah. Dana took another sip of her coffee, then set it down on the edge of Felicia's desk. Let me ask you something, she said. Felicia looked at her, wary now. What? When was the last time you did something specifically for him? Felicia opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Dana didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence, just watched. Felicia's mind moved quickly now, scanning back through the last weeks, then months. Dinners? That had been Larry. Cleaning? Mostly Larry. Conversations? Brief. Functional. Usually initiated by him. Affection? She frowned slightly. I don't know, she admitted. Dana nodded, as if that answer aligned with something she had already suspected. Okay, she said. Second question. When was the last time you noticed him stop trying? Felicia's frown deepened. What do you mean? I mean, Dana replied evenly. People don't just wake up one day and decide to emotionally detach. That's usually a process. You said he's been supportive. Has that changed recently? Felicia hesitated again. Images surfaced. Larry not sitting beside her on the couch anymore. Larry not reaching for her hand. Larry not asking if she wanted to do something together. Larry making space. Her stomach tightened. Yeah, she said quietly. When? Dana asked. Felicia swallowed. A couple of weeks ago. Maybe longer. Dana tilted her head slightly, considering that. And did you ask him about it? Felicia shook her head. No. I just thought. He was probably busy too. Or tired. Dana let out a small, thoughtful hum. Okay, she said. So from his perspective, you slowly pulled away. and then he eventually stopped reaching. Felicia didn't respond. She didn't need to. The pattern lined up too clearly. Dana leaned back against the divider now, crossing her arms. Look, I'm not saying he handled it perfectly, she continued. Jumping to pregnancy is creative. Felicia let out a small, involuntary huff of laughter. Right? But everything before that? Dana went on. That's not exactly irrational. Felicia's shoulders slumped slightly. I didn't realize, she said. I believe that, Dana replied. But that's kind of the problem. Felicia glanced down at her desk, tracing the edge of her keyboard absently. I thought I was just adjusting to the job, she said. You were, Dana agreed. But you adjusted everything else around it too. Felicia's chest tightened. That's not fair, she muttered, though there wasn't much force behind it. Dana raised an eyebrow. Which part? Felicia hesitated. All of it felt unfair, but not in a way she could argue against. I wasn't trying to push him away, she said instead. I know, Dana said again, but intent doesn't cancel out outcome. There it was. The same sentence, reframed. Hearing it from someone else didn't soften it. If anything, it reinforced it. Felicia leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling again. For a while, neither of them spoke. The office noise filled the gap. Keyboards, distant conversations, the occasional muted laugh. Normal. Everything felt frustratingly normal. Who are you texting? Dana asked suddenly. Felicia blinked, caught off guard. What? You said you're always on your phone, Dana clarified. So who is it? Felicia hesitated, then shrugged. Mostly people from work, group chats, one-on-one stuff about projects, complaining, venting. Dana studied her carefully. Anyone in particular? Felicia thought for a second. There's a couple of people I talk to more regularly, she admitted. Dana's expression didn't change. Do you smile when you text them? Felicia let out another small huff. Sometimes. More than you smile at your husband? The question landed cleaner than Larry's had. Because this time, Felicia couldn't deflect it as easily. She sat there for a moment, then sighed. Yeah, she said quietly. Dana didn't gloat, didn't push. She just let that answer exist. Felicia rubbed her forehead lightly, the weight of the realization settling deeper now. I didn't think it mattered, she said. It's just conversation. It's easier. There's less pressure. Of course it is, Dana said. It's work adjacent. Low stakes. No shared history to maintain. Felicia nodded slowly. And with Larry, she trailed off. It's real, Dana finished. Yeah. They both sat with that for a moment. Then Dana leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on the top of the divider. So what are you going to do? She asked. Felicia blinked. What do you mean? I mean, Dana said, perfectly calm. Your husband thinks he's already lost you. The words hit harder than she expected. But I'm right here, Felicia said. Are you? Dana asked. Felicia opened her mouth again, closed it. Dana didn't soften the question, because it didn't need softening. Felicia exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting to her phone lying face down on the desk. For the first time in months, it looked like an interruption rather than a refuge. I can fix it, she said, more to herself than to Dana. Dana raised an eyebrow slightly. How? Felicia hesitated. And for the first time since the conversation started, she didn't have an immediate answer. Not a deflection. Not a justification. Just a gap. And inside that gap, something unfamiliar settled. Not fear. Not quite regret. Something closer to urgency. Because for the first time, the situation didn't feel like something she could passively adjust to. It felt like something that would continue with or without her. Felicia picked up her phone, staring at the dark screen for a moment. Then slowly, deliberately, she turned it off. Dana watched her do it, a small nod following. Okay, she said quietly. That's a start. Felicia set the phone back down, exhaling as if she'd just removed something heavier than it had any right to be. Yeah, she said. But as she sat there, staring at nothing in particular, one thought pressed forward, clear and unavoidable. Starting was one thing. Catching up might be something else entirely. Chapter 6: A Crisis by Comfort. If there was one thing Felicia Connor had never expected, it was that the quiet in her house would become competitive. Not loud, dramatic competition. Not arguments or tension bubbling over into obvious conflict. No, this was worse. This was the kind of competition where nothing visibly fought her, and yet she was steadily losing ground. By Wednesday evening, 3 days after she had turned her phone off at work, Felicia had mapped out what she believed was a reasonable plan. Step 1, be present. Step 2, re-engage. Step 3, rebuild. It seemed straightforward. It was not. She discovered that being present required more than physical proximity. Larry was already home when she walked in that evening, something she noticed immediately. Not because it was unusual in itself, but because he was in the living room, not waiting. He sat on the couch, laptop open, something on the screen casting a faint light across his face. He wasn't hunched or tense. If anything, he looked comfortable. that stood out. Larry glanced up when she entered. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she replied, watching him carefully. There was no hesitation in his tone, no distance in the word, and somehow that made it harder. "What are you working on?" she asked, stepping further into the room. Larry turned the laptop slightly so she could see. "I'm planning out the spare room," he said, "thinking about turning it into something functional." Felicia blinked. "What kind of functional?" He smiled faintly, small but real. "I'm debating between a workspace and something else. Maybe both." "Something else?" she asked. "Yeah. I've been reading about a few hobbies I never got around to picking up," he said. "Figure I have the time now." There it was again. Time. The word slipped casually into his sentences, but each time it landed, Felicia felt it more clearly. "You've always had hobbies," she said, trying to sound light. Larry shrugged. "Some. Not many. I used to prioritize other things." He said it without looking at her, which meant he didn't need to. Felicia walked closer, hovering near the edge of the couch. "What kind of hobbies?" she asked, pushing forward anyway. Larry clicked something on the screen. "Woodworking, maybe," he said. "Or something quieter." Still figuring it out. Felicia nodded slowly. "Woodworking?" she repeated. "That's new." "Yeah," Larry said. "That's kind of the point." He didn't elaborate. He didn't invite her deeper into the conversation. And that was when Felicia realized something unsettling. Larry wasn't shutting her out. He was simply no longer pulling her in. There was a difference. She sat down carefully on the opposite end of the couch, turning slightly toward him. "So, how's your day been?" she asked. Larry clicked his laptop closed halfway, resting his hand on the top. "Good," he said. "Just good?" she pressed lightly. He thought about it for a second. "Productive," he added. "Got a lot done." Felicia waited. That was it. No expansion. No stories. No complaints. Just contained. She forced a small smile. "That's good." He nodded once. Silence stretched between them. Not empty, but unfilled. Felicia felt it immediately. This was where she used to look at her phone. This exact space. The space between words. The space that now felt heavier because she wasn't escaping it. "So," she began, trying again. "Do you want to do something tonight? Together? I mean." Larry glanced at her. Not surprised. Just assessing. "Like what?" he asked. The question caught her unprepared. She had focused so much on deciding to engage that she hadn't actually defined the engagement itself. "I don't know," she said. "We could watch something, or go out. Or just something." Larry leaned back slightly, considering. "I'm okay with that," he said. "Do you have something in mind you actually want to do?" Felicia hesitated. "Not specifically." He nodded. "Then maybe pick something," he said. "I'm flexible." It sounded reasonable, because it was. But it also shifted something subtly back onto her. Effort. Initiation. She nodded quickly. "Okay, I'll think of something." Larry gave her a small, polite smile and reopened his laptop. Conversation closed. Felicia sat there for a second longer, staring at him. At how easy it seemed for him to return to what he was doing. At how natural it looked. That's when the thought hit her. He's not uncomfortable. That realization sank deeper than anything else. Because if he had been uncomfortable, she could have worked with that. Discomfort meant friction. Friction meant connection. This was smooth. Too smooth. Later that night, Felicia stood in the kitchen, staring into the fridge without really seeing it. Behind her, she could hear Larry in the spare room. Not struggling. Not frustrated. Just working. A quiet rhythm of movement. Content. She closed the fridge slowly, leaning her forehead lightly against the door. "Okay," she muttered to herself. "This is fine." It wasn't. But she didn't have a better starting point. She turned, grabbing 2 glasses and filling them with water. Then, taking a steadying breath, she walked down the hallway. The spare room door was open. Larry stood inside, adjusting something on the wall. He looked over when she appeared. "Hey, hey," she echoed, holding up one of the glasses. "I brought you water." He smiled faintly. "Thanks." He crossed the room, taking it from her with an easy motion. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange. A small thing, barely noticeable, but to Felicia, it felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. She lingered in the doorway. "So, progress?" she asked, gesturing vaguely around the room. Larry glanced around, then nodded. "Yeah, it's coming together." "It looks good," she said. "Thank you." Another pause. Felicia shifted her weight. "I was thinking," she said carefully, "maybe we could go out this weekend. Like we used to." Larry took a sip of water, considering. "I'm not opposed to that," he said. "Not opposed." Felicia felt the words settle. "That doesn't sound very enthusiastic," she said, attempting lightness again. Larry gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "I'm just not trying to force enthusiasm," he said. "If we go, we go. If we don't, we don't." Felicia blinked. "That's a very Larry way to say that." He chuckled softly. I'm consistent. She smiled faintly at that, faded quickly. Do you not want to? She asked, more directly this time. Larry met her eyes, his expression steady. I'm open to it, he said. But I'm also okay staying in and working on this. He gestured around the room. This is actually kind of enjoyable. There it was. He wasn't rejecting her. He was choosing himself. And not in a dramatic, retaliatory way. In a calm, content, almost peaceful way. Felicia felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest. When did this become enough? She asked quietly. Larry tilted his head slightly. When did what become enough? This, she said, gesturing between them, then around the room. You doing your own thing. Us not really. She trailed off. Larry thought about the question for a moment, then answered simply. When it had to. The words landed gently, and completely. Felicia swallowed. That's not what I want, she said. Larry nodded. Okay. The response felt neutral again. Too neutral. I mean it, she added, her voice tightening slightly. I don't want us to just drift like this. Larry watched her for a long moment. Then he spoke. Then don't drift. The simplicity of it almost made her laugh. Almost. That's not, she started, then stopped herself. Because, frustratingly, it was exactly that simple. Just not easy. Felicia exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping a fraction. Right? She said. Larry nodded once, then turned back toward the wall he had been working on. Conversation concluded again. Not abruptly, not rudely, just naturally. Felicia stood there for a second longer, watching him. Watching how comfortable he looked inside this new structure he had built for himself. And for the first time since she had started trying to fix things, she understood something clearly. Larry wasn't waiting for her to catch up. He had already moved forward. Quietly, methodically, without leaving, but also without needing to be followed. Felicia turned and walked back down the hallway, her mind unusually quiet now. Not because she had answers, but because she finally understood the real problem. This wasn't about pulling him back. It was about proving she could still reach him. And for the first time, that didn't feel guaranteed. Chapter 7 Renegotiation. Felicia did not rush into the next attempt. That, more than anything, marked the difference between her previous efforts and what she understood now had to happen. Before, she had approached Larry the way someone patches a crack. Quickly, instinctively, with the assumption that the structure beneath was still intact. Now she understood the crack wasn't superficial. It wasn't even recent. It had formed slowly, quietly, reinforced through neglect disguised as adjustment. Rushing would only prove she still didn't understand that. So she waited, not passively, observantly. For 2 days, Felicia watched Larry the way he had been watching her. Not suspiciously, not accusatorily, but deliberately. She noticed how he moved through the house with purpose. How he filled his time without defaulting to her presence. How he still spoke to her politely, normally, but without attaching himself to the outcome of those interactions. And more importantly, how consistent he was. That was the part she couldn't ignore. This wasn't a reaction. This was a decision. Which meant if she wanted to reach him, she couldn't disrupt it with emotion alone. She had to meet him where he had grounded himself. That realization settled into something firm by Friday evening. Larry was in the spare room again when she approached. The door was half open this time, the soft hum of quiet activity drifting into the hallway. He'd added a workbench near the wall since the last time she looked. Tools, actual tools now, not theoretical ideas, sat neatly arranged. It wasn't just a project anymore. It was becoming something real. Felicia paused at the doorway, resting her hand lightly against the frame. Hey, she said. Larry glanced over his shoulder. Hey, no surprise, no hesitation, just acknowledgement. Felicia stepped inside. I need to talk to you, she said. He watched her for a moment, then nodded. Okay. He set down what he was holding, wiped his hands on a cloth, and leaned back lightly against the edge of the workbench. He didn't ask what it was about. He didn't brace. He just made space. That almost made it harder. Felicia took a breath. I've been trying to figure out what to say, she began. And everything I kept coming up with felt like explanations. Larry didn't interrupt. I've been busy. Work's been overwhelming. I didn't realize how much I was pulling away. She shook her head slightly. All of that is true, but it doesn't actually change anything. She looked at him directly. So I'm not going to explain, she said. I'm going to acknowledge. Larry's expression shifted, subtle, but noticeable. Interest. Just enough to register. Felicia continued. I stopped showing up, she said. Not all at once. Not intentionally, but consistently. The words felt heavier spoken aloud. I stopped being present. I stopped choosing you. I replaced time with you, with easier things, easier conversations, easier distractions. Larry's gaze stayed steady. No interruption, no correction, just listening. Felicia swallowed. And I didn't notice. That's the part one don't like admitting. You felt it long before I did. You adjusted to it before I even saw it. She let out a small breath. And now you're okay. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Larry nodded once. I am, he said. The honesty of it didn't sting this time. Clarified. Felicia nodded slowly. I can see that, she said. Silence settled, but this time it was different. Not tense. Not waiting for conflict. Just space. Felicia shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself before continuing. I don't want a version of us where you're okay without me, she said. Not because I need you to be dependent on me, but because I want to be someone you actually choose to share your life with. Larry studied her carefully now. There it was. A slight narrowing of focus. Not resistance. Evaluation. And what does that look like to you? He asked. The question wasn't challenging. It was precise. Felicia didn't hesitate this time. It looks like consistency, she said. Not grand gestures. Not catching up all at once. Just showing up. Repeatedly. Intentionally. Larry nodded slowly. That's measurable, he said. Felicia blinked. A small, surprised laugh slipping out. That is the most you response you could have given. He shrugged lightly. You're defining something in observable terms, he said. That's easier to work with. Felicia smiled faintly, then let it settle. I'm serious, she said. I'm not asking you to believe anything I say right now. I don't expect that. I haven't earned that. Larry didn't argue. He didn't reassure her either. He just let the statement exist. So I'm not going to ask for trust, she continued. I'm going to build it, or try to. The room felt very still now, controlled, balanced. Larry crossed his arms loosely, considering her. And if you don't, he asked. The question landed cleanly. Not pessimistic, not hopeful, just realistic. Felicia met his gaze. Then at least I'll know I didn't leave it where I found it, she said. That was the first moment something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, just a flicker. Respect, maybe. Recognition. Something that hadn't been there before. Larry uncrossed his arms, letting them rest loosely at his sides. That's different, he said. Felicia exhaled quietly. Yeah, she agreed. It is. Another pause. Then carefully, what do you need? She asked. Larry didn't answer immediately. Not out of hesitation. Out of consideration. Took a few seconds. Then time, he said. Felicia nodded immediately. Okay. And consistency, he added. She nodded again. I can do that. Larry tilted his head slightly. Don't say that like it's guaranteed, he said. Say it like it's something you're choosing. Felicia paused, then corrected herself. I'm choosing to do that. He nodded once. That seemed to satisfy him. And you? She asked quietly. Are you choosing to stay? That question carried more weight than anything she'd said so far, because it acknowledged something she hadn't before, that he might not. Larry held her gaze. I haven't left, he said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. Felicia accepted it, because now she understood something she hadn't before. Answers weren't what mattered. Patterns were. And patterns took time to reveal themselves. She let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing slightly. Not in relief, but in acceptance of where they were. Okay, she said. Larry nodded. Conversation complete. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just concluded. Felicia turned toward the door, then paused, glancing back at him. For what it's worth, she added, a trace of warmth slipping into her voice. The room looks good. Larry glanced around it briefly, then back at her. Thanks. She hesitated for half a second. Then she stepped forward, closed the distance, and gently, deliberately, she rested her hand against his arm. Not lingering, not forcing, just there. A clear action. Then she stepped back and walked out of the room. No expectation, no follow-up, just a choice made and finished. Larry stood still for a moment after she left, his gaze lingering on the doorway. His arm still registered the brief contact, not physically but contextually. A data point, small, but distinct. He looked down at the tools on the bench, at the room he had built, then back toward the doorway. Something had changed. Not enough to redefine anything, but enough to register. And for the first time since he had started adjusting, Larry Connor didn't just observe. He considered, which, in his world, was the beginning of everything. Chapter 8, different and better, change did not arrive in a single moment. It didn't declare itself with certainty or resolve itself into something easily labeled as fixed. There was no clear point where Felicia and Larry sat across from each other and said, this is where everything turns around. Instead, it accumulated. Line by line, choice by choice, and, most importantly, consistency by consistency. The first week after their conversation in the spare room felt less like repair and more like recalibration. Felicia didn't attempt anything dramatic. She didn't plan elaborate dates or force emotional conversations that neither of them were ready to have. She simply showed up. When Larry came home, she put her phone down. Not with a noticeable gesture, not as a performance, just without thinking like she used to. When they ate dinner, she asked questions and waited for the answers. Actual questions, not placeholders. What part of your day took the most effort? she asked one night. Larry looked up from his plate, surprised just enough to register. Oversight meetings, he said. Not because they're complicated. Because they require attention without producing anything tangible. Felicia nodded, leaning slightly forward. What do you mean? And just like that, something small shifted. Because she listened. Not to respond. Not to fill. But to understand. Larry noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. But he didn't react immediately. He added it to the pattern. Observed. Measured. Waited. The second week was where things became slightly awkward. Not in a bad way. In a human way. Felicia stood in the kitchen one evening, holding 2 plates, staring at the living room where Larry sat reading something on his tablet. She hesitated, then walked in and sat beside him. Not across. Not hovering. Beside. Close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Larry glanced at her briefly, then back at his tablet. No comment. No acknowledgement. Felicia waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then she leaned slightly toward him, peeking at the screen. What are you reading? Larry angled the tablet so she could see. Beginner woodworking techniques, he said. Felicia smiled faintly. You're serious about that? I tend to be when I invest time in something, he replied. She nodded. That tracks. Another pause. This time, Felicia didn't fill it with retreat. She stayed, just present. After a moment, Larry shifted the tablet between them. Not fully offering, but not withholding either. Felicia leaned in slightly, reading along with him. Neither of them spoke for a while, and yet it didn't feel empty. By the third week, something became clear to both of them. Not through words, through alignment. Felicia wasn't pushing. Larry wasn't resisting. They were adjusting. Together this time. Saturday arrived again. The same day that had once quietly unraveled something between them. Felicia stood in the doorway of the spare room, now undeniably a workshop, watching Larry sand down a piece of wood with measured focus. You're getting better, she said. Larry glanced up, a small smile forming. That's the goal. She stepped inside, looking around. The room had changed. Not just in structure, in presence, felt used. Alive in a quiet, functional way. I picked something, she said. Larry raised an eyebrow slightly. For tonight. He set the sandpaper down, brushing his hands off. Okay, he said. What did you pick? Felicia hesitated just long enough to make it real. There's a small restaurant downtown. Nothing fancy. But we used to talk about going there and never did. Larry considered that. Not the restaurant. The memory attached to it. Okay, he said finally. The same word as before. But different. Less neutral. More deliberate. Felicia nodded. A small smile settling in place. Okay, she echoed. They didn't rush out the door. Didn't treat it like an event that needed to compensate for lost time. They moved at a normal pace, because now normal meant something again. Dinner was easy. Not perfect. Not magically restored to what it had been 5 years ago. But easy in a way that felt earned. They talked. Not about everything. Not about nothing. Just enough. At one point, Felicia paused, setting her fork down as she looked at him. You're different, she said. Larry glanced up. So are you, he replied. She smiled slightly. That's fair. A beat passed. Then she added more quietly. I don't think we broke anything. Larry tilted his head. No, I think we just stopped maintaining it, she said. And didn't notice until it stopped working. Larry considered that, then nodded slowly. That's accurate. Felicia let out a soft breath, relieved not by the answer, but by the alignment. And now? She asked. Larry leaned back slightly in his chair. Now we're maintaining it again, he said. Just more intentionally. She smiled. I can work with that. Later that night they returned home. The house felt the same, but also not. Felicia moved toward the hallway, then paused, glancing back at him. Larry stood near the living room, setting his keys down. There was a moment there, unscripted, unplanned. Felicia stepped toward him, slowly, deliberately. Hey, she said softly. Larry met her eyes. Hey, she didn't overthink it this time, didn't measure the moment into hesitation. She closed the distance and wrapped her arms around him. Not tightly, not dramatically, just naturally. Larry stilled briefly. Then, just as naturally, he returned the gesture. No hesitation, no analysis, just presence. They stood there for a few seconds, not trying to turn it into something larger, not trying to define it, just letting it exist. When they stepped apart, Felicia looked at him, something lighter behind her eyes now. Good night, she said. Good night, Larry replied. She hesitated, then added, with the faintest hint of amusement. Consistently. Larry smiled. Consistently, he agreed. Later, as they settled into bed, the space between them no longer felt like something measured. Felt shared again. Not identical to what it had been, but something better, because it wasn't assumed. It was chosen. Larry lay on his back, staring at the ceiling for a moment before turning his head slightly. Felicia was already half asleep, facing him. There was no phone between them, no glow, no distraction, just quiet. Larry exhaled slowly, something settling into place that hadn't been there before. Not certainty in the old sense, not automatic trust, but something stronger, observable, repeatable, real. He reached out, resting his hand lightly over hers. She didn't wake, but her fingers shifted slightly, instinctively curling against his. Larry allowed himself a small smile. People only change their behaviors when something has changed in their life. He had believed that for years, tested it, confirmed it. Now, lying there in the quiet, he recognized something he hadn't considered before. Change didn't only explain loss, it explained rebuild. And this was different, intentional, measured, honest, respectful, everything he had ever required. Everything else negotiable.